Mike Bara is an engineering consultant for major aerospace companies for more than 25 years. His first book, Dark Mission: The Secret History of NASA, was co-authored with renowned researcher and lecturer Richard C. Hoagland and was a legitimate New York Times bestseller, making me not too jealous, Mike. The compelling subject of Mike's lecture is the title of his book, Dark Mission: The Secret History of NASA. Please welcome me in giving a warm welcome to Mike Bara.
Okay, thanks very much. We're just going to wait for the, do I do this, or do they launch it? Yeah, wait a minute. All right, we're going to launch the PowerPoint here pretty soon. I was just going to start by saying I was really surprised at how much of, how many things I'm going to talk about were actually in the previous lecture by Farah, and hold it closer, okay, by Farah, and there's actually some symbols and things I'm going to talk about, but what we're going to really discuss is sort of an occult, esoteric influence inside NASA, and we're going to do some other things too related to, I guess the best way to describe it is extraterrestrial archaeology. If you've ever listened to Richard or seen any of his lectures, listen to him on Coast to Coast AM, you know that that's his shtick, is that there's stuff out there on the moon and on Mars that NASA found a long time ago, at least as far back as the 1960s and maybe even before that. Okay, so I work with Richard on the Enterprise mission, which is his website and sort of his institute that he uses to do different types of research. And I got involved with him about 10 years ago, and my main focus was on what we call the ritual alignment model of NASA's behavior. And as I get through this lecture, I'm going to hopefully explain that to you in detail. What it really amounts to is that NASA is not what it appears to be. It is basically a secret society in of itself. It was dominated by members of secret societies, and these people had a very specific agenda when NASA was formed. In fact, it may be in fact that NASA was formed for the very specific reason, to go to the moon and recover evidence of whoever lived there before, a long, long time ago. Our book, as I mentioned, is Dark Mission: The Secret History of NASA. This is the new cover we're going to put out on the next edition. It looks like we're going to do a special edition next year, a very small run of a better version with better pictures. One of the compromises you have to make in a book like this, it was 550 pages, is that sometimes the pictures don't get to be as big as you'd like them to be, and they don't get to be as high fidelity. So we're going to put it out with full high-resolution images and things like that people can really see, because a lot of this story is visual. And our tagline at the bottom there is, "The lie is different at every level." And what that basically means is kind of what Farah was talking about, and I think what some of the other lectures are going to talk about, which is that everybody in this hierarchy thinks that they know what's going on. And the truth is they've been lied to by the people above them. And it's a sort of a giant pyramid scheme. And what our task is to try to figure out, from the perspective of NASA, is what is the truth behind all the lies that they've been telling for 50 years. Okay, this whole thing started, and I apologize if you already know the whole history of Mars and Cydonia and all that stuff, but I have to assume that the audience doesn't know this history, so I have to go through it. It started in 1976 with this picture. This is called the face on Mars. It's just a sort of a mesa in the middle of an area called Cydonia on Mars, and this picture was taken by Viking 1 in 1976 on July 25th, which is actually the anniversary is coming up. And what happened was a NASA scientist named Toby Owen looked up and he said, hey, look at this, guys. And the next day they held a press conference, and at that press conference Gerald Soffen, one of the project engineers for Viking, said this. He said, "Isn't it peculiar what tricks of light and shadow can do? When we took another picture a few hours later, it all went away. It was just a trick, just the way the light fell on it." Well, that was a lie. And really, that's the first time I think that people begin to question seriously whether NASA told the truth, not just about this, but about anything. Because the fact is, there was no picture that was taken a couple of hours later. They should have known that, because the planet continues to spin underneath and the probe continues to orbit around this way, so obviously they weren't anywhere near Cydonia, plus the fact it was dark at that time and they couldn't have taken a picture. So this kind of went nowhere for about 4 or 5 years until a guy named Vince DiPietro and a partner of his named Greg Molinar at the Goddard Space Flight Center decided to go look up, let's go look up that face on Mars picture. And they did, and when they found it, they also found another image. This is 70A13, it's another image taken about 35 days later, and a higher sun angle, about 10 degrees higher, and it shows a little bit more of the right side of the face. This is a processed version of the first image, 35A72. So again, just to go back here, look at how much better it got when professionals started working with it. Here it is, the very first NASA processed version, and then as we go forward, which I didn't plan on doing, this is what happened when Dr. Mark Carlotto eventually got a hold of it in the mid-1980s. So it started to look a lot better. It had a lot of features that maybe made it look like it might be a sculptured object. It had apparently 2 eye sockets that were pretty well balanced. It had a mouth. It had some suggestion of nostrils. There's something that looked like they might have been teeth, and those turned out not to be teeth. But basically it had a symmetrical platform and a lot of things that suggested that it might in fact be constructed. Well, my partner, my co-author, Mr. Hoagland, got involved and formed 2 separate independent organizations that were dedicated to researching the subject and the question of whether the face itself and Cydonia in general had artificial structures on it. Eventually they found some items like the city over here is a collection of pyramid or pyramidal mountains that appeared to be possibly artificial. There's a huge object called the D&M Pyramid after DiPietro and Molinar. It was named after them. That has a vaguely pentagonal shape to it, a bunch of other odd stuff. The cliff, a very, very straight line that looks like it was sort of constructed on top of an ejecta blanket from a crater, and another object called the Tholus, which is a very round mound. All these things are in conflict with each other in terms of geology. In other words, there's reason to think that they're artificial just based on looking at them, a lot of their characteristics, but even more than that, they don't agree with each other. So whatever could have formed this thing, and actually there's nothing that could have formed that naturally, but whatever could have formed the D&M or the face would not be the same process that would have formed something like the Tholus. So they all appeared to have different geomorphic characteristics. So what we're going to look at first is the city, and Hoagland called it the city. It had a lot of different features identified within it, especially this thing over here, the fortress, which appeared to be sort of a triangular shaped building with an internal wall at about 60 degrees. And then there were these little objects that are called mounds that appeared to be sort of arranged geometrically. Now, if you look at the fortress a little closer, what we expected to see was an internal wall. When we got better pictures of it later on, it turned out that there wasn't any internal wall, that it was all, in this case, a trick of light and shadow. But one of the things that's really interesting is that in order to get a shadow like this, a triangular shadow, you basically have to have a triangular peak. So this is an object that someday I want to spend some more time studying, because it looks to me like it once had a triangular base. It appears to have been inundated on the side, and I think it might be a collapsed tetrahedral pyramid, and we'll get to that later on. Here's a quick morph of the Mars Global Surveyor images versus the old Viking of the fort, what we thought it looked like and what it now ends up looking like. Some of the other objects, the cliff is very, very strange. It's this sort of bizarre, very straight ridge. There doesn't seem to be any really, it shakes a lot too. There's an earthquake. Very, very odd shape to it. And are we okay? Okay. The straight line like that is really, really unusual in nature. Later on, we've got more pictures of it from Mars Odyssey 2001, right over here, the Mars Global Surveyor, where they managed to miss part of it in high detail, and then Mars Express, a color image, and it just continues to look really bizarre. It looks like it was sort of pasted on top of this flow over here, which again would suggest it's possibly artificial. The other object that's really interesting here is the Tholus. This thing is a round mound. There's very similar to some earthen mounds in England. It has sort of a moat or trench around it. It has a couple of layers. There's a little opening right here, which may or may not be an entrance. Mark Carlotto did some three-dimensional projections of this original Viking data, and it appeared to have sort of a little peak on top of it. So there were reasons to think that this stuff might be artificial, and there was all kinds of people involved in these early investigations. Now, early on, they developed some ideas about there being possible relationships, mathematical relationships between some of the objects. For instance, there seemed to be a proportion. If you took one measurement being from the outside edge of the city to this thing called the city square, that was 1 unit. If you took that and then started looking, and you had 2 units would be the edge of the fort, and then 4 units would be the face, and then over to the cliff, and 1, 2, 4, 8, that kind of thing, which kind of made them think that perhaps there was something more to this. But the really, really interesting, intriguing object was this one, the D&M Pyramid, which basically appeared to have a pentagonal shape. There was quite an argument early on between guys like DiPietro and guys like Richard Hoagland as to whether this was a 4 or 5-sided object, because the early Viking imagery was not that great. However, under processing, it pretty much ended up looking like a pentagonal form. Now, later on, a guy named Errol Torin, whose job was at the Defense Mapping Agency, basically his job was to look at satellite images and decide, okay, is this a camouflaged artificial structure, or is this a naturally occurring mesa or building, rock or some sort of formation like that? And basically he came up to Richard and he said, look, I've got a great background in this stuff, and I don't know of anything that can naturally explain the formation of the D&M pyramid. Now, not only that, but he sort of eventually said that, look, this thing has a very specific set of internal geometry and angles that to him implied that if you were to reconstruct the way it was originally built, that it was a huge pentagon. Here's the most current, fairly up-to-date image of the D&M. Let's go back to it, sorry, of the D&M. And it does have these sort of 5 buttresses, is what Richard calls them, connecting, all sort of spread out. There's a very weird entrance wound or exit wound of something, and it appears to be collapsing. Now, this sort of caving in aspect is really unusual for a mountain. Mountains don't usually cave in like that. They're usually very rigid, and they also don't usually form pentagon shapes. Later on, under the high-resolution images, there was eventually a second sort of symmetry figured out by a guy in England, and he said that, look, if you take this thing, there's got one axis of symmetry that way and another one that way. If you include this little platform it seems to be resting on. Here's some of the latest images. Again, the Mars Global Surveyor composites. This is the color Mars Express. And this is a 3D perspective that was generated by the European Space Agency with their Mars Express imager. It's really cool because they have this camera that takes 2 pictures at basically the same time. And you can then use those as a stereo pair to create 3D out of it. So I don't know, if it was me and I was standing on the surface of Mars or flying over this thing and I saw this face like that and I saw that face going like that, I would assume that it was a pyramid. Now there's some people that have written books. There's one called The Real Mars, where he talks about the D&M, and he's actually fairly fair to Richard in his work, considering that he's a kind of a skeptic. And he says, oh, it's obviously a natural formation. Well, I don't know. If I looked at this, I don't think I would conclude that was natural. I'd conclude it was a ruined, gigantic pyramid. Here's the other side. Again, another facet like that. So this thing, to me, has all the earmarks of something that used to be a pyramid, almost like the ones we have here on Earth, except that it's a hell of a lot bigger. Now, Torin also figured out this internal geometry, included a lot of mathematical constants. And what happened was they then went back and said, okay, let's take those same numbers and go back and look at all the stuff we've already decided might be artificial, and do these same numbers repeat? And the answer was, yeah, that they did repeat. And they got some numbers that repeated very consistently. One of them that stood out a lot was this one, 19.5 degrees or 19.5 degrees. If you've ever heard Richard on Coast to Coast or read the book, you certainly see a lot of 19.5s in there. Well, 19.5 degrees in this particular case has to do with the mathematical properties of an object called a tetrahedron. A tetrahedron is the simplest of the 5 so-called Platonic solids. It's basically a 4-sided pyramid, and it doesn't have to have equilateral triangular faces, but it can. That's called a regular tetrahedron, and essentially it seemed to have something to do with tetrahedrons. In fact, a lot of the numbers appeared to be derivatives of this tetrahedral geometry, but not necessarily just a plain old tetrahedron by itself, but specifically a tetrahedron surrounded by a sphere. If you were to take a physical tetrahedral pyramid, especially a regular tetrahedral pyramid, and encase it inside of a sphere, and you anchored one of the points at the North Pole or the South Pole, what would happen is the other edges, the other vertexes, would touch that sphere at 19.5 degrees, or more precisely 19.47. We rounded up to 19.5. So what did that mean? Good question. What happened was that some other researchers later, a Dr. Horus Crater, who worked with a group called SPSR, that we don't get along with very well, went back and looked at some of these mounds that I mentioned earlier, and he said, hey, not only did you guys get some tetrahedral geometry out of the stuff that you derived from the other major monuments, but if you look at these mounds, they're also laid out according to various tetrahedral mathematics. And he did some calculations on the odds, and he came up with the odds of about 250 million to 1 against that layout being by chance. Now, these little mounds are really interesting because if you look at them in close-up, this is an image of one of them from Mars Global Surveyor, and it vaguely looks like a buried tetrahedron. So if you look at some of the other ones, here's another one, again, appears to be a tetrahedron buried partially. You've got one facet there, one facet there. So if you try to imagine if it were to be extended and not be completely buried in junk, that you would see that tetrahedral shape. Now, all of these are about the size of these objects, the Great Pyramids at Giza. So we're not talking about small stuff. We're talking about really, really big objects. Here is a later Mars Global Surveyor image of this same object. And again, you can see it appears to have, if you were just to extend these sides, it looks like it's, to me, like it's a buried tetrahedral mountain. And then you've actually got another one. This is in Candor, Chasma, which is a different area of Mars, that looks like the same kind of thing. Now, I keep hearing from people that, oh yeah, well, stuff forms like that on Earth all the time. Okay, I've yet to see a picture of those. I see lots of stuff that looks like this on Mars, but I don't see any of it on Earth. I'm waiting. As soon as somebody can show me a picture of something that looks like a buried tetrahedron that they can tell me is completely naturally formed, I'll believe it, but I haven't seen it yet. Okay, there were some other things that popped up too, which is that the Tholus itself, as we got some close-up images of that, had sort of a triangular-shaped cap to it, and it looked like it might be an eroded, worn-down tetrahedron. So you had this message over and over again from Cydonia that it seemed to have something to do with tetrahedrons being important. So what happened next was that they did some more observations, they did some more studies, and they found that this 19.5 degree number seemed to be really important if you looked at other objects in the solar system. What you found was that, for instance, the Great Red Spot on Jupiter is a storm that formed at around 19.5 degrees, and it's been there as long as we've been observing Jupiter. If you were to take, again, this is a situation where you have Jupiter's magnetic field is anchored at the North Pole, and you have the disturbance or the upwelling of energy in the south. The same thing on Neptune. Neptune had a storm when they first went to visit it with Voyager in 1989. It's called the Great Dark Spot. It also formed right around that 19.5 degree latitude. And even on Mars itself, the Olympus Mons volcano, the largest volcano in the solar system, is right around 19.5 degrees. And if you actually were to go one tetrahedral vertex over, as if there was a giant tetrahedron inside of Mars, and then go north, you'd come right to Cydonia. So it's almost as if this stuff was all laid out trying to convey this message of tetrahedrons. Well, again, what did that mean? It turns out that way, way back at the beginning of physics, when these things were very, very early being thought of, and electromagnetics and things like that were being figured out, a guy named John Clerk Maxwell, who did some of the original equations on electromagnetism, had started looking at using tetrahedral geometry as a way of solving certain problems. And what the mechanism implied by him, or by his work, was that if you had energy traveling through higher dimensions, higher spatial dimensions, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, up to a 26th dimension, that you would feel energy or see energy coming out from these higher dimensions in our three-dimensional reality according to this tetrahedral geometry. That was what his very early work implied. Einstein said that his work was the most profound and the most fruitful that physics had experienced since the time of Newton. And that's what Einstein said about James Clerk Maxwell. Now, unfortunately, not everybody felt that way. There was a guy named Oliver Heaviside who didn't like this hyperdimensional, higher dimensional aspect of Maxwell's work. And when Maxwell died, he did exactly what he wanted to do. He said this stuff is mystical. The scalar or higher dimensional component is mystical and should be murdered from the theory. And that's exactly what he did. He removed all of the higher dimensional aspects, all of the tetrahedral geometry from Maxwell's equations. And so the electromagnetic physics equations that we use now and that we teach to engineering students is all based on a subset, a very small Newtonian subset of what originally Maxwell intended to be a much, much bigger picture. So as a result, we're working with limitations by which we will never unify electromagnetism and gravity, we'll never obtain control of gravity, we'll never have anything but chemical rockets, we'll never have warp drive, we'll never have Star Trek, as long as we adhere to the equations that Heaviside gave us, that are called Maxwell's equations, but in fact are Heaviside's, not his. Now, physics is not my thing. It's Richard's thing, and he's very good at explaining it, but I decided what's the simplest way that I can sort of explain this to people. And I came up with this, actually. I found this on Far Side cartoon where you've got an ant, being basically, underneath a magnifying glass, being heated up, and he can't figure out why. So try to imagine a sheet of paper like this, and imagine that you're an ant and you're living on that sheet of paper. And we'll pretend for a minute that you're a two-dimensional object, because in reality an ant is three-dimensional, but he can't necessarily perceive what's going on above him. If I were to take a magnifying glass and hold it up between the sun and the piece of paper, and that energy came down and hit that piece of paper, it would create heat in a very specific pattern, a circular pattern. Now this ant can come crawling along, and if he hits that, he's going to feel it. In fact, he's going to be able to walk around and measure the dimensions of that energy. But he has no idea where it comes from. All he can do is see it, feel it, and measure it. He has no idea or no perception of where that comes from, and that's basically what we're talking about when we're talking about higher dimensional physics, or hyperdimensional physics, as Richard likes to call it. So we can see the effects, and that's what we think we're seeing in these energy upwellings on different planets and that sort of thing. It has to do with spinning processes and all sorts of interesting stuff. In the book, we talk about Einsteinian tensor torsion fields and things like that. And if you really want to get into depth on that, I would advise you to go read chapter 2 of the book of Dark Mission. So what you have then is this concept of these tetrahedrons being somehow driving physical forces in the universe. This is what's called a double star tetrahedron. It's just basically the same shape of a tetrahedron encircled by a sphere. And again, you've got the 19.5 degrees touching. This is another artistic representation of what's called a double star tetrahedron, and again, having it circumscribed. But it's more commonly known as we take it into two dimensions. If you take that three-dimensional object and flatten it in two dimensions, you get this, which is pretty much known as the Seal of Solomon, the Star of David, the flag of Israel. And what I want you to notice is that as well as this triangular shape, this dual triangle shape that you have here, in the middle you have another shape, which is a hexagon. So other mathematicians had been working on this problem of higher dimensions, higher spatial dimensions, higher realities. And one of them was a guy named Coxeter, HMS Coxeter, which sounds like a ship and Star Trek, but in fact it's not. And what he said is that for any system, and when he says system, he means, for instance, the solar system, because in his hyperdimensional physics, everything is connected. All the stars and planets are connected, and they're influencing each other. He said, look, if you're going to have these visible upwellings of energy coming through from the other dimension, you're also going to have a point where energy from this dimension is going to go out, and it's going to, that inwelling point is going to be hexagonal. So guess what? On Saturn, there is a hexagonal cloud pattern on the North Pole of the planet, which has been spotted there from the time that we first observed Saturn up close, which is on Voyager in 1989. You can see it vaguely here. That is a real cloud pattern. These are the Voyager images, and what's happening is these clouds are actually making these turns and making this hexagonal shape. And there's absolutely nothing in physics as we understand it today that can account for that. There's nothing. So recently we went back, and here's what the Cassini probe found just last year, which again is this hexagonal cloud pattern in the North Pole, which again seems to imply that the planets are following rules of physics that we do not fully understand, or at least we don't have any real model for. Here's another image from Cassini, and here's actually a movie of this. And you can see that the outer clouds are moving a little bit faster than the inner cloud. It's actually turning at a lower rate, and it's maintaining its hexagonal shape. And there's really nothing that can account for this except this weird, bizarre topological mathematics. A couple of other things I wanted to talk about real quick. Farah's presentation, she talked about water rituals and healing rituals and things like that. And there was actually a guy named Dr. Hans Jenny who did something that's now commonly called somatics. And what his experiments involved was taking particles and suspending them in fluid, or taking sand and putting them on metal plates and then vibrating those fluids or vibrating those plates at different frequencies. And when he would do that, he'd find that the sand or the particles would organize themselves into these geometric shapes. And very commonly you had, well, this one I just thought was so cool, I just wanted to put that one in there. It's not really got anything to do with it, but at certain frequencies you'd get hexagonal shapes in the middle. And then later on, one of the ones that I thought was really, really interesting was this one, which again, you're seeing this double star tetrahedron shape. This is one of the water particulates, and it just basically forms itself along these geometric lines. So it seems to be implying that there is a physics involved with vibration. And of course now, you know, the big thing in physics today is this string theory, which is that we've all got these vibrating strings inside of us that are tuned to different frequencies and all this stuff. And gee, guess what? It's basically just sort of the poor man's version of hyperdimensional physics, what Maxwell was working on back in the 1800s. So there seemed to be a message to this mathematics of these ruins at Cydonia, and that message seemed to be a couple of things. First of all, the tetrahedron is the base building block of the physical universe. And there's a lot more about that in the book. Right now, in fact, there's even been some mathematical modeling they've done that they think that the atoms inside of you, the nucleus of the atom, which of course nobody's ever seen, they expect it now when they find it to not be the little round rubber ball that we've all seen in our atom diagrams and movies when we were a kid in school. They expect it to be a double star tetrahedron. Now, of course, they're not connecting it to this other stuff, but I think it does connect. And the other message was, look, higher spatial dimensions exist, and if they do exist and there's energy coming through from them, what that means theoretically is that you can master that energy. You can have unlimited energy. You can control gravity, which would explain a lot of the stuff we see from UFOs, flying saucers, some of their behavior, which seems to be outside of our known laws of physics. Okay, so back to artifacts. It looked like in the early 1990s that this subject was going to be settled. We had a new probe going to Mars called Mars Observer. This is it. And it was going to be going in 1993 and taking high-resolution pictures of the surface of Mars. The problem was NASA had no interest in taking any pictures of Cydonia or the face. In fact, they were really, really hostile to the idea. It got to the point where they would send people out, like here's Dr. Stephen Squires, who now runs the Mars Exploration Rover program over at JPL. He's Carl Sagan's protege at Cornell. They sent him out to debate Richard and some other people on the question of Cydonia. This is a great one. Richard's got these videotapes, and I'm trying to get them for the special edition of Dark Mission to put them in a DVD so people can actually see this, because at the end of this debate, what happened was Squires had to admit that he never actually looked at any pictures of the face or of Cydonia, but he was out there claiming there was nothing to it, even though he'd never looked at the pictures. Now, the whole thing came to a head in early 1993, right before Mars Observer was going to power itself into orbit and begin its initial science phase or pre-science phase and start taking pictures. They sent out Dr. Bevan French, who was the chief project scientist on the Mars Observer program, to debate Richard on Good Morning America. His position was, he was trying to defend the position that basically this one guy, Dr. Michael Malin, should have total control over all the images taken by the Mars Observer and should not have to release them and should have total autonomy over what should and should not be taken with basically a space probe that you and I, with our tax dollars, paid for. At the end of the whole thing, Richard again mopped up the floor with him. The host, Bill Ritter, finally said, look, Dr. French, why don't you just take the pictures, immediately release them, not embargo them, and then prove these guys wrong if they're wrong. And of course, French didn't have an answer for that. Well, what happened after that was really, really interesting, because about 2 minutes after they went off the air, after French had lost the debate just the way that Stephen Squires had lost his debate with Richard, Mars Observer disappeared. Or more precisely, they claimed it had disappeared 14 hours before. Now, I don't know, if you're the chief project scientist, I find it hard to believe that you don't know that your probe has been missing for 14 hours when you go on national television and debate the question of artifacts on Mars. It seems to me that he could have gone on there and said, look, we really can't talk about Cydonia because we're not even sure if we have Mars Observer anymore. It disappeared 14 hours ago. We can't communicate with it. That would have changed the whole thing. Instead, he goes on, he tries to win the day, he gets creamed in the debate, and then guess what? They pull the plug on the thing right after that. Now, I think that's exactly what happened. They never did determine what happened to Mars Observer because they turned the telemetry off. They turned off the radio right before they did this deorbit burn. They came up with a couple of possible scenarios. I think James Oberg, big bloated sack of protoplasm from NASA. Do you guys get the impression I don't like him very much? He tries to claim, well, they know exactly what happened. Well, they don't have the slightest idea. And the reason they don't have the idea is because for some reason they turned the radio off. And to me, it's pretty obvious. They turned it off because they didn't want anybody to know that they either A, took the thing black, or B, blew it up themselves. One of the two, because they couldn't face the reality of what they would have to take pictures of, because the pressure at that time was enormous. Now, this is a pattern that's continued to today. We have the Phoenix lander on Mars, and if you might remember back in 99, I want to say, there was something called Mars Polar Lander. Well, Mars Polar Lander was supposed to do the same thing that the Phoenix lander is now doing on the poles of Mars, but it also disappeared. And then mysteriously, NEMA, who that guy Errol Torren works for, came along and said, well, we found Mars Polar Lander, and it's right here, and it's perfectly fine. And NASA said, oh, no, you couldn't have found it. So the pattern seems to be, and there's a couple other probes that are like this, is they send one probe to Mars, it fails, quote unquote, and then they send another one. And I think what they're doing is they want to go and look for themselves first and find out what they're going to have to tell people before they do the public one. And I just think that's a consistent pattern that seems to be happening with NASA on a fairly regular basis. Well, we weren't going to get any pictures of Sidonia or the face anytime soon, so Richard and his colleagues started to turn their attention to the moon, which seems like a good place because it doesn't make any sense for people to have come to this solar system, come to Earth possibly, and gone to Mars and built these artifacts, built these huge monuments, these huge structures, and not also come to the Earth or come to the moon. So they begin to look at images of the moon. This is one of the first things that Richard found, which is in an area called Sinus Medii, which is literally called the sea in the middle. And so that was the first place he looked. And what he found was, at the very edges of some of this, was a couple of odd-looking things. This right here is actually a camera registration mark. That's not anything specific. But this guy right here is a pillar about 1.5 miles tall. You can see that it's casting a shadow on the lunar surface. The shadows are consistent with where the sun was from the perspective of the spacecraft at this time, which is lunar orbiter. And there's also this weird fuzzy thing in the background. Well, what these two objects were later dubbed was the shard and the tower. And because this has been out there for so long, I didn't include any more pictures of these things, but they're in the book and they're also available for free on our website on enterprisemission.com. And they appear to be glass structures or made of glass-like material, see-through stuff. They were reflecting light in a very consistent geometric pattern, and basically it got him started on the idea that, hey, there might be some kind of ruins on the moon as well. Here's another object, which I just, Richard doesn't think much of this image. I had to fight to get it included in Dark Mission. I look at this thing and I think, okay, again, this is a NASA photo. We have done nothing to this except enlarge it and point out that there's a huge paperclip on the moon somewhere. Now that thing is, it looks like a bent paperclip, and it's obviously some kind of antenna, and there's a series of pictures as they're going along, and what happens is because these things are transparent, made of some sort of glass, it seems like that just when the sun and the camera get aligned just perfectly, that's when you see these things, and then the next frame they disappear. But, I mean, that's some sort of pillar or tower. Again, it's probably, I don't know, 70, 80 stories tall, and there's this big wire antenna or something wrapped around it. Now that thing is really there. It's really on the picture. You can go to any NASA archive and pull this image, and I forget the image number, but again, it's in the book. And you can pull this thing out and see that it's there. So the question is, okay, you're telling me there's nothing on the moon, yet what's that? Because it sure isn't a crater. It isn't, a rock. It's something really weird. Now, the area that was found in, we dubbed, or was named Los Angeles, because it was about the size of the Los Angeles base, and it had this crisscrossing geometric pattern. And this was some images we found right before we published Dark Mission, just last summer. And it's the 4600 series. And again, you have this sort of crisscrossing pattern, and you can see what looks like maybe roads and so forth going through here. And you have these very bright, reflective, sort of interconnected, I don't know, structures, towers, glass shards. Here's a close-up of one of them, and what this really reminds me of as I look at this crisscrossing pattern here, and again, it's kind of subtle and you lose a little bit of the detail on the screen, but it reminded me of this from the Superman movies, this Fortress of Solitude. It's weird, because there's no way that can be on the moon. The moon should be boring. It should be gray, it should be dark, it should be bland, and instead you've got these bright, glowing things that are reflecting sunlight, and they have to be some sort of glass. Now, before we go to the next part, well, we'll talk about this in the next part. One of the things that happened is when Richard went around the country and started lecturing on his stuff is he met a guy named Ken Johnston. Now, Ken used to work for NASA. He was a contractor with Grumman, and he taught all of the astronauts to fly the lunar module. That was his main thing, was astronaut training. After that part of the mission was over, he went to the Lunar Receiving Laboratory where he was in charge of cataloging all the samples. And he had to take all the rock samples, compare them with pictures that had been taken of the samples, because their process was supposed to be, we're going to take a picture of this rock, and then we're going to collect the rock, and we're going to put it in a bag. And in other words, that way they would know where it was. Well, as a result, he had 4 complete sets of all of the handheld photography that was taken by the Apollo astronauts on the surface of the moon, the 6 times that we went to the moon. And yes, Virginia, we did go to the moon. After a few years, he was called into the boss's office and told that NASA headquarters has ordered that you destroy all of these prints. Now, the really interesting thing about this is these were all first-generation prints. In other words, they take the pictures, they bring the negatives back, they develop them into prints, and he got them, okay? And that made no sense. He basically begged repeatedly, can I just donate these to different universities? And they said, no, destroy them. Fortunately, he had a pang or twinge of conscience, and he didn't destroy them. He kept 1 set. Out of that set, he picked a few pictures that he kept for himself, and he gave the rest of them to Oklahoma City University. Unfortunately, it looks like one of the professors there ran off with a lot of them. But the ones he kept, some of them were pretty interesting. Here is a section of a panorama from Apollo 14, and what this would involve was Alan Shepard getting off the lunar module. The first thing he did is he took out his camera, his Hasselblad camera, and he took pictures of the horizon like this, and got a complete look of the panorama of the landing site. Now, the thing that didn't make a lot of sense if you look at this is he got an awful lot more of the sky than he needed to. That was the first thing we noticed, is that wasn't he supposed to be taking pictures of the ground in front of him? Isn't that the interesting thing? When we overexposed the background, what came out again was these blue, sort of crisscrossing, weird, geometric, bright patterns in the sky. Now, contrary to what people like David Percy might tell you, there should not be any stars in the sky on any pictures taken from the lunar surface. The reason is that you don't have any atmosphere to diffuse anything. You've got very, very extremely bright surface in front of you, which is made up entirely of glass and aluminum and titanium and very bright reflective material. And the f-stops of the cameras were set to about 1/250th of a second. So there's no way you're going to get an exposure of a star that's thousands of light years away on an exposure like that, because they had to do it that way, or they would have had the foreground completely washed out. But when we went through and overexposed these, and again, this was done both on the analog prints by normal photographic techniques, and then later scanned in and also done with digital enhancement processes, we got this weird stuff that should not be there. There should be nothing there. It was pretty easy to discount that these were scratches on the negatives or anything like that, that it was just part of the aging process. There were different ways that the film was put through various levels of tests by experts, photographic experts that we hired. And and again, in the book, we explain all the reasons why these things are really on these images, and they're not artifacts, they're not scratches, they're actually stuff that seems to be on the moon. The interesting thing was that as you went through this panorama, this overexposed panorama, what we saw is that you had really, really bright areas about 180 degrees apart, and in between that, it was darker. See how it's darker? There's less reflection going on there, and here as you get up sun, you see that it's very, very bright, and then again it gets darker. And then down sun, the opposite way, the opposite direction, you get it, again, it gets bright again, not as bright. But that's a phenomenon called backscattering. And to have backscattering, basically what you have to have is the sun coming through something, the atmosphere or glass or something, and basically scattering light from here 180 degrees away. And what you're going to get is less and less light on the sides. So if these were photographic defects, they somehow understood how to follow the geometry of the backscattering phenomenon. So we know that there's no atmosphere on the moon. So the only other option was that there's some sort of semi-transparent or transparent medium that this light is passing through. Here's the full panorama, and again you can see, up sun, down sun are the brightest areas. In between, there's these very dark areas where there's not as much light coming through, so you're not getting as much of the background exposed. Now here's one of those frames. This is called Mitchell Under Glass, and it's kind of the common name. There's astronaut Ed Mitchell right there setting up the camera. This is AS 14669301, and we've actually found, NASA has scanned a brand new version of this from what they say are their original current negatives, and the same stuff is still there. You still get this very bizarre back and forth pattern. Now, again, I understand people being skeptical about this, because what you see here is you see the stuff being very vertical, left and right, up and down, and you think, okay, that's film grain. Now, it's not film grain, but I can understand why you're skeptical. However, if you look at certain portions of this, you'll see that not all of it follows north and south and the film grain. A lot of it is actually diagonal. See this stuff here? So these look like big, huge structural supports supporting something. And this stuff right here, I'm a structural engineer, it's aerospace, but I'm not an architect, but I understand basic design. And these things are spaced exactly as they would be spaced if they were self-supporting, reinforcing bar kind of structures. Here's a super close-up, and again, as an engineer, I just immediately see engineering. Here's a couple of things that are intersecting there. And another thing I want to caution you on is that with some of these images, I see some of the reviews on Amazon, and they're like, well, the pictures don't show anything like what the guys say that they do. And there's a reason why the whole world is not engineers, and that is that about 1/3 of the population can do 3D projection in their head. They can take a piece of paper, the exercises where you have a piece of paper and they show you a shape. And they say, okay, what would this look like folded over, 5 different ways? And most people, about a third of the population, can do that, no problem. About a third of the population can be coached to see that. Art Bell was one of those guys who, if you coached him, if you said, okay, now do this and flip it that way, Art could see those things. About a third of the population doesn't. So to some extent, I understand why people have difficulty with seeing some of these things, because not everybody just immediately gets it. But there is definitely structure here. And again, as we get down to the bottom, this stuff follows the local vertical. It doesn't follow the film grain. It follows the terrain. And that, to me, was the biggest test. And one of the big reasons I wanted to get involved with Richard was when I started to see that, I started to realize, oh my God, I think this guy is right about this stuff. Now, one of the really interesting things, all those pictures I just showed you are from the Apollo 14 landing site. If you look at the Apollo landing sites, they were pretty well spread out. Here's Apollo 11 over there. I have to be done when? I don't know. Here's the Apollo 11 landing site, which was basically in the middle of nowhere. You've got Apollo 17 way up here, 15, 16, and this all makes sense if you want to get a very diverse geological evaluation of the moon, of what's really going on the moon. But notice that Apollo 12 and 14 are practically on top of each other. They're only 114 miles apart. So I don't know what, if you're looking for rocks, you're going to get the same rocks in those two places. It's very bizarre why they're so close. 45 minutes, great, okay. Also, Apollo 12 landed in the same spot as Surveyor 3, and we'll get into some of the stuff on Surveyor 3 later. But one of the cool things that they did is that they took pictures at both landing sites. Now on Apollo 12, there's a film called Pinpoint for Science, because the exercise that they were conducting was, can we find something as small as a Surveyor spacecraft, which is about as big as, the small area here, and land right next to it. So they did that on Apollo 12. But over here, so what we did is we took a frame grab from this film, a 16 millimeter film of Apollo 12, motion picture film, and compared that with the still frame photography, slide photography from Apollo 14. And guess what? The exact same diagonal structure appears in both images. So you've got two landing sites near each other where you can see the same structures over the horizon on two completely different types of film media. So again, I think wherever this stuff is, these big diagonal features, they're either out here somewhere or out there somewhere. Now, all I've got to do at some point, and this is on my list of things to do, is find out the landing sites, again, find out what the orientation of the camera was when they took those pictures, and just doubly confirm that they were looking in the same spot. And I'm going to guarantee you that they were looking in the same direction, and they were seeing the same big, gigantic structures beyond the horizon. Okay, here's a close-up of, actually taken from another frame, I think this is Apollo 16, of something similar, and we put this in the book because to me, it's basically we're talking about scaffolding on the moon. Now, I can look at this because I'm trained to do it, and I can see all kinds of layers to this. I mean, I see basically a sheet going this way, and then this box structure sticks out to my eyes. You've got stuff going along here. You've got reinforcing stuff coming across that way. Intercostals, you've got stuff here. You've got this stuff. These are not, again, these are not scratches. They're way above the level of many scratches. They don't look anything like true film scratches. And I can see layers going this way, up and down. And to me, this is just astonishing. When Richard showed me this for the first time, my mouth just dropped open. Because to me, this is all engineering. Now, the question comes back to glass. It doesn't make a lot of sense to most people's way of thinking that you would build stuff on the moon out of glass, because glass shatters easily. But the truth is, glass only shatters easily on the Earth. And the reason it shatters easily on the Earth is because we cannot make glass without getting moisture in it. On the moon, there's no moisture. And what happens is that when you make glass with no moisture and you make it in a vacuum environment, it is actually stronger than steel. So the reality is, if you're going to build structures on the moon to protect yourself from meteorites, the perfect material is glass. In fact, what they're talking about now with Bush's new space program is actually, guess what? Building the structures, the protective structures, out of glass. They're in fact going to use the glass that's already on the moon because they figure there's no moisture in it. They're going to process it and make it there. An architect named Robert Feartech went through and he put together a bunch of these images, and he looked and did all this point sourcing and plugged everything into a CAD program, and this is what it spit out. So this, we think, is what we're talking about on the moon. It's basically a giant scaffolding type of structure. It's probably in some places as much as 20 miles high. Now, I can't believe I did this, but there's a great picture that's in the book that I forgot to put in my presentation that was taken by Apollo 15, and it shows the moon as they were looking back at the moon. And again, we overexposed it, and you can see what looks like an air glow around the moon. Now, on the Earth, we have what's called the air glow limb, which is basically the atmosphere of the planet, and you can see that above the actual physical horizon. The moon doesn't have an atmosphere, but in this picture, there's only two explanations. Either the moon does have an atmosphere, and that's what they saw in this picture, or there really are these gigantic sort of semi-transparent glass structures on the moon. Here's one last shot that I really like. This is one that was actually pilfered off the desk of the director of NASA in 1972, and it wasn't James Webb at that point, it was another guy. But a reporter friend of Richard's was in there for a meeting. The director was called out of the office for some reason, and he started looking through the pictures on the guy's desk, and he found this. And again, this is Mare Crisium. You've got a sort of partially covered crater here. You've got this bizarre little spiky thing sticking up, and in the close-ups you can actually see there's it looks like supports coming in to support this towering thing. Again, it's several miles high, and on the official version of this image now on all the NASA websites, that thing is not there. But I trust this more than I trust what's on the NASA websites. Okay, probably the most important thing that Ken actually had in his collection was this. It was a reproduction of a patch, original patch of the Apollo program. And on that patch, you see the Earth, you see the launch from Cape Canaveral, a little path going to the moon, you see the moon, that's supposed to be Apollo's face, I think. But the weird thing is that inside this A is the constellation of Orion. Now, Orion in the mythology has nothing to do with Apollo. Apollo and Orion are basically completely separate in terms of Greek mythology. Orion is only significant in the Egyptian mythology. So here's Orion. It's the most obvious, brightest constellation in the sky. The belt stars are very famous. Of course, I was looking at them last night while we were watching fireworks up in Albuquerque. And to the Egyptians, Orion was the place where their greatest god, Osiris, resided. Now, Osiris was the Egyptian god of death, resurrection, judgment. He was basically their top guy. A lot of his characteristics were later borrowed, some people say, for Jesus Christ and the Christian theology. But basically, Orion and Osiris were inseparable in terms of the Egyptian stellar religion, the astrology that the Egyptians operated on. They essentially they were so important that they took the belt stars and basically recreated them, mirrored them on the surface at the Giza Plateau with the three great pyramids. The relationship between those pyramids and the Nile was set up to duplicate the relationship between the Milky Way and Orion's belt. At least that's what some people, Robert Bauval, Graham Hancock, Adrian Gilbert, believe, and I think absolutely that they're correct. There also was one other object that was very sacred to the Egyptians, and that was the star of Sirius, which is sort of a companion that follows Orion through the night sky. Now, Sirius represented, it's called the dog star commonly. It is called the dog star primarily because it resides in Canis Major, which is a constellation that's thought by some people to appear to be a dog. And as far as the Egyptians, one other thing I wanted to put in there. Basically, they're companions. Wherever you see Orion, generally you see Sirius right afterwards. I was really interested in Farah's presentation earlier. She had some tarot cards up there, and the very first tarot card, I believe, and I'm not an expert, is the Fool. And immediately when I saw the Fool, I realized that this was supposed to be representing Sirius and Orion, and something important, something esoteric, something important about them. The dog there represents Sirius. This is Orion. I had to flip it around because in the Fool, it's backwards. But you know, I think that's definitely what's going on. If you watch the Indiana Jones movie, where they have the Nazca lines in the movie, and they show this big spider on the ground, and one of the spider has this one leg that goes way, way over. Again, that's Orion and Sirius. So even the Peruvian culture, the Incas, whoever built those Nazca lines, also understood there was something really, really significant and important about Orion and Sirius and their relationship. Anyway, Sirius represents Isis in the stellar religion. This is the wife and consort of Osiris, his constant companion, the mother of his child Horus. Her hieroglyph is an equilateral triangle, which was kind of interesting because it seemed to match up with the tetrahedral motif of Sidonia. And Sirius, in fact, is pretty interesting. It's a double star system. It's a binary. This is Sirius A and Sirius B. This is actually the only picture, I believe, of the two of them together that you can see from Earth. And again, they were they were inseparable. Isis and Sirius meant the same thing to the Egyptians. The sun was Horus, and he was represented frequently by the falcon god, or the falcon-headed god. As the falcon-headed god, he was also associated with the constellation of Leo, the lion. And of course, the belt stars of Orion, Osiris's belt, the three great pyramids, are guarded by a sphinx, a leonine creature, which has now a human head. Some people think that, or pretty sure that that was not always the head, that somehow the pharaoh came along and carved his face onto it. And it may have one time been a falcon's head. I don't know, it's hard to know. But the Sphinx certainly seems to be connected to Orion in the same way. The Sphinx is connected to the pyramids in the same way that Horus is connected to Orion. Also, some of the iconography we talked about earlier, Isis and Horus. Isis, again, was also a moon goddess. This is supposed to be the disk of the moon in her hat, and she's feeding the infant Horus. Same thing, Madonna and child, that we have in the Christian faith today. And the story of Isis and Osiris, and trust me, I'm getting to the point, basically is that Osiris was the good ruler of Upper and Lower Egypt. He was the husband and brother of Isis. He was murdered by his evil brother Set, who usurped his kingdom. He was resurrected by Isis, put back together. She conceived Horus with Isis, or Isis and Osiris conceived Horus, and then Osiris left to go live in Orion and become the judge of the underworld. And Isis went into hiding until Horus reached maturity, and then Horus returned and vanquished Set and took control of Egypt again for the good guys, and basically every pharaoh since then has supposedly been descended from Horus. Okay, this thing about disappearing is related to what's called the helical rising of Sirius. It was an event that took place back in ancient Egypt, still takes place today, but basically what happens is, from the perspective of the pyramids, Sirius disappears from the night sky for about 70 days before it reappears. When it reappears, this is commonly called the helical rising, and that date was a very sacred date in the ancient Egyptian calendar, and it marked the beginning of the Egyptian New Year. That date, back in 3300 BC, was July 20th, when Sirius would rise, this very early morning thing. You would see it once again return to the night sky. Now, what has any of this got to do with Apollo and going to the moon? Shouldn't have anything to do with it. But, of course, we all know that we did go to the moon. We landed there with Apollo 11 for the first time. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon. We all got to watch it on TV, those of us that were alive then. And of course, the date that they landed was July 20th, 1969. Now, that in itself doesn't mean a whole lot, but there's more coming. In his book about his trip to the moon, Buzz Aldrin, the second man on the moon, talked about something that he did inside the lunar module before they went out and took the first moonwalk. And he said, during this first idle moment, I took out some wine and some chalices that I had in my personal preference kit, little kits they could take with them to the moon, and I had communion on the moon, read from the book of John, yada, yada, yada. Well, that ceremony, as it turns out, is of course a Christian ceremony, but it has its roots in ancient Egypt. Guess what? Ancient Egypt, and it's an offering to Osiris. That's where this communion ceremony originally started. So, again, you've got, on a very sacred date, a guy making an offering to Osiris, which is a little bit weird, sacred Egyptian date. The whole thing was portrayed in From the Earth to the Moon, the very excellent Tom Hanks miniseries on the trips to the moon. This is how it was portrayed. I don't know if it was red wine or white wine, but in the show it was white wine and Buzz taking his drink there. So we got real curious. When did they actually do that ceremony? So we went to something called the Apollo Lunar Surface Journal, which is a great resource. If you want to know anything about Apollo, any of the programs, any of the missions, it's all right there. And you went back and we looked and we found out that there was a break at a very interesting time in their process as they were talking back and forth to mission control before they went out. So we could take astronomy programs like Redshift 2. This is the one that Richard and I like to use because it's based on the JPL database, because we want to be working on the same database that NASA's working from. And we found the exact location on the lunar surface where Apollo 11 landed and the time, and we plugged it all in. And what we found was that Isis herself, Sirius, was 19.5 degrees above the landing site. Now, that may not seem super significant, but it certainly did to us because of this whole tetrahedral thing from Sidonia that we've been thinking of, the Egyptian connection of the date of July 20th, and the fact that Sirius was Osiris. Basically, here's what you've got, is you've got Buzz Aldrin making an offering to Osiris on the most sacred date in the Egyptian calendar, the ancient Egyptian calendar, with Sirius at 19.5 degrees. Now, I'd be more impressed, actually, if it had been the horizon, which was the really, really important location in the Egyptian stellar religion, or the meridian, which is the north-south line that seems to go over it. But, again, there's more to the story. The first lunar landing of Apollo 11, we all know the story. They came down, and what they've always told us is that, well, you know, we flipped over, and Neil Armstrong looked down, and he saw a bunch of boulders, a bunch of rocks. And he said, oh, well, we can't land there, so we got to find someplace else to land. So he flew it at great risk to him and Buzz and found a nice, soft, empty spot and landed. The only problem is that if you look at pictures of the landing site, there's nothing there. It's nothing but dirt, okay? And this is actually where they did land. This is the ground track. And here's Neil basically telling them that, you know, we wanted to find a really good area. This is his official statement from the technical debrief. Or actually, that's not from the technical debrief. That's actually from the radio dialogue that's in the Lunar Surface Journal. And if you look around the landing site, there's no boulders. Okay, there's no boulders anywhere. These are not big rocks. These are like that big. Okay, and the LEM could have landed on those and not even noticed them. In fact, the people at the Apollo Lunar Surface Journal have been looking for boulders at the landing site for years, and here's one guy where the guy says, a boulder, maybe? That's a boulder somewhere there? They're desperately trying to find boulders. Nobody can find any boulders. So what was the real reason? Well, the real reason, we think, is that if they had landed where they'd been prescribed to land, the alignments of Sirius at 19.5 degrees at the prescribed time would not have worked out, but they had to move about 4 or 5 miles downrange. Now, the interesting thing was that the ceremony took place 33 minutes after they landed. So again, that may be significant, it may not, but it was the only place on the lunar disk where you could actually have Sirius at 19.5 degrees above the horizon 33 minutes after they touched down on July 20th, 1969. Now, on board, they had a camera, a telescope, sextant, and what I found the other day was that they were actually using this sextant to look for stars, and the stars that Buzz Aldrin said he was looking for were Capella and Rigel. Now, Rigel is in the constellation of Orion. It's right by Sirius, and if you could see Rigel, he absolutely could see Sirius. Another thing that they talk about later on, here's Rigel, here's Sirius, is that, you know, it was so bright on the lunar surface that it was really hard to fix our position because the stars looked really dim. Now, Sirius is the brightest star in the sky. So I don't believe him when he says I was looking at Rigel. If you really were having a hard time seeing this stuff, why wouldn't you look at the brightest star in the sky, which is Sirius? And I think it's because he didn't want anybody to know that they were basically looking through the telescope to see when Sirius got into the right position so he could perform his little communion ceremony. It's also confirmed later, and I had a sound clip, but we're going to skip that, where Armstrong says to them, hey, Buzz is going to give a try at seeing some stars through the optics. So he's sending a signal back to somebody in mission control, Buzz is looking at the stars. So here's Buzz Aldrin, the second man on the moon. Pictures taken by Neil Armstrong. There's virtually no intentional photographs of Neil Armstrong on the moon. And I think that's because Neil Armstrong's job was to photograph the first Scottish Rite Freemason on the moon, who was Buzz Aldrin. This is New Age magazine from 1969. It depicts Buzz on the moon. Here is, that's the structure of the Scottish Rite. Well, at any rate, the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry has 33 degrees. The first 32 you can go up voluntarily. To the very top level, the 33rd, you have to be invited in. Here's the symbol of the 33rd degree of the Scottish Rite. It is the double-headed eagle that Farah was talking about a little bit earlier. There's the equilateral triangle with the number 33 inside of it. So you've got eagles, you've got tetrahedrons, and you've got 33s. And again, this may have something to do, in my opinion, with why the lunar module was named Eagle. I don't think it's just because it was the American eagle. Here is the lunar module Eagle on the moon on July 20th, 1969. And in their book, The Hiram Key, Christopher Knight and Robert Lomas come to the basic conclusion that the rituals of Freemasonry are a recreation of the story of Isis and Osiris. Now, I don't have time to go into that. I don't have a lot of quotes. It's a great book. Read it. And it basically tells you that the Freemasons, at their core, worship Isis and Osiris as their gods in the same way that the ancient Egyptians did. So what you have is an American astronaut who was a Freemason, he's now a 33rd degree Scottish Rite Freemason, performing a ceremony to one of Freemasonry's gods on July 20th, which is a sacred date in ancient Egypt that celebrates ISIS coming up from underneath the underworld at 19.5 degrees, 33 minutes after they landed. So didn't think that was a coincidence. Also, this is the flag that Buzz Aldrin took with him to the moon. This is what's on the cover of Dark Mission. It is a Scottish Rite Supreme Council of Southern Jurisdiction flag, and on the back, of course, there's the triangle, the double eagle, the 33. And when he got back, he proudly presented it to Luther Ellis, who was the head of the Scottish Rite at that time. And he was greeted there by some other guys. This is Kenneth S. Kleinknecht, or sorry, C. Fred Kleinknecht Jr. His brother was Ken Kleinknecht. Ken was the head of Project Mercury, Project Gemini, and Project Apollo for NASA. So you have a guy whose brother eventually became the head of the Scottish Rite in the United States, was running the Apollo programs where all of this weird Masonic esoteric stuff took place. Ken was also worked for one of the two direct single points of contact between NASA and the DoD. Here is C. Fred Kleinknecht welcoming Buzz to the House of the Temple. Here's C. Fred with President Reagan. Very important guy. And here's the official crew portrait of Apollo 11. And most people, most of the time they show you this, they crop it off right about here, because what Buzz is wearing is his Masonic signet ring. And Buzz was married, and I don't think his wife was too happy with the fact that when he went to the moon, he wasn't wearing his wedding ring, he was wearing his Masonic ring. And in fact, he still wears it today, and he's also divorced. So wife number one, I don't think was too happy about that. So you have all these connections. The only thing that doesn't make a lot of sense at this point for us is this 19.5, which sort of implies tetrahedrons and hyperdimensional physics and all that stuff. But what we eventually found was is that as you went through the different major events in NASA, here is the Apollo 12 landing site, which, remember, they already had picked out because they were going to land there because Surveyor 3 was there, with Orion right in the very sacred Egyptian position, right on the horizon. Apologize for the graphic, but it's badly compressed. Ranger 7, the very first mission to the moon, we went back and looked at that, the first mission America ever sent to the moon. When it launched from Cape Canaveral, the moon was 33 degrees below the horizon. But again, the Egyptians understood astronomy well enough that it didn't matter to them whether these things were above or below the horizon. They still knew where they were. Here's the actual Ranger 7 impact site. One of the belt stars of Orion is right at 19.5 degrees. And what happened was, as we started looking at stuff, the Apollo 8 lunar orbit insertion, we found these alignments at either the meridian, the horizon at 19.5 or 33 degrees over and over and over again. And in fact, it's got to the point where there's literally, we've got hundreds of them. So we stopped even bothering. We had an expert on probabilities do a study, and she said the odds of all these being coincidence are about 19 billion to 1. Now, even if she's 99.999% wrong, it's still 19 million to 1 that this stuff is all just coincidence. So again, the Apollo 15 landing site, it's actually Falcon was the name of it, not Flacken. I misspelled it. So again, you have a lunar module named Horus, basically, landing on the moon with his father, Orion, Orion's belt, at 33 degrees above the landing site. Apollo 17 landed at 19.5 degrees on the moon. More of them. Even the first face on Mars picture, 35A72, we went back and we looked at the location, right where the face is, right when they took the picture, and guess what? Orion's belt was at 30 or 19.5 degrees above the landing site, or above the face itself when they took that picture. So basically what it comes down to is the ritual alignment model, as we call it. It involves just these locations. You've got the meridian going left and right, or right ascension. You've got the horizon, 19.5 above and below the horizon. That's it. Basically 95 to 99% of the sky is off limits for one of these alignments. So when people tell us that these are common, it's not true. 95% of the sky doesn't count. Here's an example of the meridian, just to explain it to you. And again, this was really important to the Egyptians, and again, I could fill a whole book with why the meridian was critical to the Egyptians, but it's in there. So what we found out, basically, was that NASA was dominated by 3 cults, 3 secret societies. We dubbed them the Masons, the Nazis, and the Magicians. Now, because I think I'm running a little short of time here, am I already over time, or am I okay? 15 minutes, okay. So we're not going to run the videos, okay, because we're over time, because I talk too much. Basically, all 3 of these organizations had at their root belief system that the belief that Isis and Osiris and Horus were their gods. Okay, so what you had is the James Webb, 33rd degree Scottish Rite Freemason, who was director of NASA. Ken Kleinknecht was his chief lieutenant who ran all the programs. Below that, you had all these astronauts, many of whom walked on the moon. You had Wernher von Braun and these Nazi dudes at different parts, different key positions. And over at JPL in Pasadena, near where I live, you had some interesting characters as well that we'll get into. Now, the guy who picked all the landing sites, all of the landing sites where we're seeing all these alignments, these Egyptian ritual alignments, guess what? Was he American? No, he was Egyptian. His name was Dr. Farouk El-Baz. He ran the entire site selection committee. All of their meetings were private. All of their meetings were classified. None of their paperwork has ever been declassified. And his father, believe it or not, wait for it, was an expert in the ancient Egyptian stellar religion of Isis and Osiris. So basically you have the son of an expert on the Osiris cults picking these landing sites where all these interesting stellar alignments take place. The Nazi factor was basically run by Wernher von Braun, the guy who invented the V-2 rocket for the Germans, the man who sold the moon, a very famous biography. Linda Hunt wrote a book called Secret Agenda where she talks about Project Paperclip and the fact that von Braun and many of his cohorts were considered to be ardent Nazis. President Truman specifically said no ardent Nazis can be brought over under Paperclip. But as you'll see, von Braun was certainly an ardent Nazi. Here he is with some of his buddies. Here he is with Der Fuhrer himself in 1938. We can all tell the mustache there. And there's von Braun, a close-up of him. Again, I apologize for the quality of the pictures, but they're taken off television, so it's hard to get really good cuts of them. This was in 1938, before the war actually started. Here he is with some of his friends at Peenemünde, one of the camps where they built some of the V-2s. And here he is as he was captured later on by the Americans. Now, one of the things about von Braun that most people don't appreciate is that he was not just a German rocket scientist. He was not just a Nazi rocket scientist. He was a member of the SS. The SS was, guess what, a secret society who believed that they were descended from Atlantis and their gods of Atlantis were Isis and Osiris and Horus and so on and so forth. And the real proof of this is that there's a picture of von Braun at his SS induction ceremony attended by none other than the Reichsfuhrer, Heinrich Himmler, the #2 man in Nazi Germany, who was also his close personal friend. Here's a close-up version from the Biography Channel documentary on von Braun. Nobody argues that this is Wernher von Braun. So he was a member of the SS, a secret society which was dedicated to the occult study and worship of Isis and Osiris. We'll skip over this. This is the book. Dr. Nicholas Goodrick Clark from Oxford wrote a great book called The Occult Roots of Nazism. He explains Madame Blavatsky, all the stuff, some of the stuff you heard about earlier, basically how all the Aryan cults became the SS and got roots in Nazi Germany. Well, that's really interesting because it turns out that we landed on the moon with Surveyor 3, remember where Apollo 12 came back later on, the Pinpoint for Science thing, on April 20th, 1967. There's Surveyor 3, here's the Apollo 12 astronaut, I think it's Pete Conrad. Walking up to Surveyor 3, there's a lunar module in the background. And that date, April 20th, happens to be Adolf Hitler's birthday. Okay? Guess what? Later on, they landed on the moon with Apollo 16 on April 20th, 1972. And the lunar module was named Orion. So basically you had a lunar module named Osiris landing on Adolf Hitler's birthday on the moon with, guess what, Sirius, Osiris's wife and consort at 33 degrees below the horizon. So you had a lunar module Horus, a lunar module Osiris. This is Dr. Vannevar Bush, who brought a lot of these guys over. Don't have time to go through this because we're running out of time. Dr. Donald Menzel, who's associated with MJ12. At any rate, this basically says that they were able to have put together a computer that could have figured all this stuff out for them. And again, it was Freemasons who created this computer. As you can see, von Braun made no attempt to disguise his Nazi sympathies. Here he is with a bunch of his buddies at Fort Bliss, Texas. There's a swastika right on the Billy the Kid saloon there that they used to hang out. It looks like a flying saucer with a Nazi swastika on it. The one and only test complex where they tested the V-2s when they got back was Launch Complex 33. By the way, we're at about 33 1/3 degrees latitude right here in Roswell, aren't we? Does anybody know, is the ranch where the crash took place, is it south of here or north? Anybody know? What? North. It's north? So close to 33 degrees, but not exactly. I would have been more impressed if it had been south, but okay. Just But let's see, if it's 60 degrees yeah, I thought we were about 33 1/3 here. But anyway, Launch Complex 33, there's the one runway at the Cape is runway 33. The two launch pads that they launched the manned missions from are launch pads 39A and 39B. Every other launch complex is like, they number them 30, 32, 31, 32, 33, but then there's two 39s. Take 39 divided by 2, you get 19.5, all this weird stuff. Von Braun was associated with Disney, who was a Scottish Rite Freemason, a 33rd degree. We've all heard the stories about there being a Club 33. He produced a program called Man in the Moon, which is all about the first trip to the moon. In that program, and I apologize, we had video, but it went over, they actually sent up a flare and they spot, guess what, an alien base on the dark side of the moon. All these little messages that von Braun put in stuff. At JPL, you had people like Theodore von Karman and Jack Parsons. Jack Parsons was the probably most preeminent rocket scientist of the 1930s. He invented solid rocket motors, solid rocket fuel. A tremendous breakthrough which got us into the space age, and he was an occultist. He was a very, very close associate of Aleister Crowley, who was mentioned earlier. There's a great book by Farrell House called Sex and Rockets, all about Mr. Parsons. JPL was founded on Halloween, 1936, so there's all these little occult things. Here's Crowley, dressed up as a 33rd degree Scottish Rite Freemason. Nobody knows if he ever was. He claimed to have been channeling messages from Horus himself, trying to change the world. I'm going to skip through a lot of this stuff. One thing that's really interesting is that there's a new book out called Secret Agent 666, and basically what they're saying is that Crowley apparently was on our side. He claimed to have been working for the Allies as an agent, a secret agent, and was influential in getting Rudolf Hess to defect to the West. So that's another thing I've got to get into. Here's Parsons at his mansion in Pasadena. Again, Farah mentioned Rosemary's Baby, and really I think Rosemary's Baby is a depiction of something that took place in California with Jack Parsons and a guy named L. Ron Hubbard, who went on to found the Church of Scientology. They did something called the Babylon Working, and it involved a woman named Marjorie Cameron, who went straight from her job with the Joint Chiefs of Staff as a secretary to Jack Parsons' mansion and started having sex with him. And the purpose of it was to create what's called a moonchild in magical thinking, magical circles. Basically, it's a child that's going to have spiritual powers, godlike powers, and the purpose of it was to give birth to the Antichrist. And again, this is a little bit about it. I don't have time to go through it, but the purpose of the whole thing is the Babylon Working, as it's called, is to bring on the apocalypse and create the Antichrist. So this is the guy who founded the Jet Propulsion Laboratory out in Pasadena that does all the unmanned probes. And again, at their core root belief system, they have the same belief in Isis, Osiris, and Horus as their gods. So again, it makes complete sense that they would be doing stuff to, this sort of following this ancient Egyptian astrology. So let me get to the last part of it here. So basically everybody who was anybody at NASA was a member of one of these three different groups. They all had the same core belief system. They seem to have stamped their process, their behaviors, or their influence on the program in very specific ways, landing on the moon on Hitler's birthday, landing in accordance with this strange Egyptian astrology. And the next time we went back to the moon, Mars, was in 1997 with Pathfinder. Guess what? After all this stuff had come out, after Richard had done all these presentations, presented this stuff at NASA, all about hyperdimensional physics and tetrahedrons, they go back to Mars with Mars Pathfinder, and the space probe itself is shaped like a tetrahedron, and they landed it at 19.5 degrees by 33 degrees on Mars. So even Graham Hancock couldn't resist that one. He said, okay, I think you got us on that one. Again, Earth was there. There's stuff at the landing site that looks bizarre. There's pyramids. There's something that looks to me a little bit like a sphinx at the Mars Pathfinder landing site. And so the 33 degrees, why is it important? What we think is that 33 degrees is sort of a code for 19.5 degrees. And what this basically tells the person that understands the code is that if you can figure out the secret of the tetrahedron of how to harness that energy, you can basically have unlimited energy and technology that can allow you to do stuff like make flying saucers, make stuff that can do incredible stuff that can defy gravity. One of the relationships is that the sign of 1947 is 33333. A tetrahedron also has something that's called, there's a nodal scientific notational system called the Schiaffli system, and its symbol is 3, 3. If you take the comma out, you get 33. So again, I think 33 connects to tetrahedrons. There's all sorts of other interesting stuff. If you were to start out at the Great Pyramids at Giza and you were to set your compass at 333, you would end up on the doorstep of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. I mean, literally right at the front door, at the front gate. So there's all kinds of weird things that are, this is some other stuff. I work right here. I'm not going to tell you who I work for, but I work in Space Park, the Space Park area of Redondo Beach. And I noticed as I was driving around that there's all these there's Gemini Drive, there's Mercury Avenue, there's Columbia Avenue, and there's also Isis Avenue. Where is it? Right there, Isis Avenue. And there's also a street called 33rd Street. And, okay, so Isis comes through here. 33rd is, where is it? Did I miss it? Okay, so anyway, 33rd and Isis intersect right here, and there's these buildings with pyramids on them. There's a funny little symbol there, which looks like an 8-pointed star, which is an occult symbol. So there's kind of this weird encoding that goes on in architecture. It's what Farah was talking about all this sort of, these architects seem to have follow the same bizarre astrological practices. Here's the Luxor Pyramid in Vegas. I love to go to Vegas. I love to stay there. And there's a Sphinx guarding it, and its actual address is 3900 Las Vegas Boulevard, which again is 19.5 times 2. So I'm looking at this stuff, and I'm going, this is not a coincidence. And now they don't even hide it anymore. We're going back to the moon, we're building Apollo again, and we're going to call the program Orion. They may as well just call it Osiris. So before they hid the symbol of Orion in the Apollo patch behind a Greek mythology, now they just come right out and say it's Orion or Osiris. Okay, I'm pretty much, is that it, or can I keep going? I got some time. Okay. One of the questions we had when we first presented this stuff for Dark Mission last fall was, okay, so what? So they did this. Besides the fact that they stole our space program from us, and they did things to their own occult, ritualistic belief systems and didn't tell us they were doing them, what is the impact of this? Well, I think the whole impact has to do with this document. It's called the Brookings Report. It's officially titled Proposed Studies on the Implications of Peaceful Space Activities for Human Affairs. And in this document, which was commissioned by NASA at the dawn of the space program, it essentially tells them, you are probably going to find artifacts. You're going to find ruins. You're going to find exactly the kind of stuff that we see in these pictures on the moon and on Mars. And if you do find them, you should consider whether you should withhold it from the public. The reason it describes, the reason it gives is because cultures that suddenly discover they're not the top dog when they thought they were the top dog disintegrate. And it specifically says, War of the Worlds is a great example. The War of the Worlds broadcast by Orson Welles. Society could disintegrate. So President Kennedy is considered basically the father of the American space program. And the story is that, we were in a space race with the Russians, and we were trying to beat them, and it was all about politics and Cold War politics and all that stuff. But Kennedy, right after the Brookings Report was delivered to Congress and right after the Russians put a man into space, Yuri Gagarin, Kennedy went out and he gave a speech. And the speech was called The President and the Press. And basically what he did is he went to the press and he implored them to help him root out secrecy and secret societies. This is a quote. He said, "The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are as a people inherently and historically opposed to secret societies." Who do you think he meant by that? Secret societies? Maybe the Masons? To secret oaths and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweigh the dangers which are cited to justify it. And I think what he's specifically referring to here is the Brookings Report, which he just received a few weeks before that. Now, 2 weeks after this speech, he goes on and he says, guess what? We're going to go to the moon. And we're going to do it before this decade is out. And then he goes to Vienna, where he meets Nikita Khrushchev in June of 1961. Now, this is generally considered a disastrous foreign policy defeat for President Kennedy. But what people did not know until very recently was that at that meeting, he proposed to Khrushchev, not that we have a competition in space, not that we have a space race, but that we go to the moon together in one joint space program. Khrushchev rejected it. He made the offer again in secret right after the Cuban Missile Crisis. He said, look, Nikita, we've got to find a way to come together. We've basically stared down the barrel. We almost got ourselves blown up. And we need to try to find a way to work together. And Khrushchev again rejected him. But then in 1963, in August, he proposed secretly once again to Khrushchev, let's go to the moon together. Let's stop this insane competition. And Khrushchev turned him down. So Kennedy said, to hell with it. What I'm going to do now is go do this publicly. So I went to the UN on September 20th, and he said, we need to start cooperating in space with the Soviet Union, with the Russians. He made a public proposal. The Russians did not respond. The press reaction was pretty negative. Here's a cartoon from the period saying, I was afraid something like this might happen if you kept talking about it. There's Kennedy and Khrushchev locked up in the rocket. We'll send them to the moon. Politicians were opposed to it, particularly a congressman named Albert Thomas from Houston, who was a close political ally of Lyndon Johnson and who controlled all of NASA's funding. Now, the whole thing took an interesting turn. We didn't really, when we were writing the book, it never occurred to us we were going to get into the Kennedy assassination. But this stuff came across our desk that we didn't know about, which is that Khrushchev's son, Sergei, says that after the UN announcement, his father reconsidered and decided that he was going to accept Kennedy's offer to go to the moon together. He put the timing of that in late October or early November of 1963. Now, Sergei Khrushchev is pretty much an impeccable source. He's a fellow at a diplomatic school at Brown University, an Ivy League school. He is definitely a scholar. There's no doubts about it. But what happened was the whole thing was scuttled when President Kennedy was killed about 10 days later. We all know the story. What we don't know, maybe, is this was the last National Security Action Memo that John F. Kennedy ever signed. And what he says in it is that I want you, Mr. James Webb, the director of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, to start creating an office where we will start sharing information with the Soviet Union, our space and technology information with the Soviet Union, because we're going to go to the moon together. Now, the president would not have done this, given the political opposition, unless he had a hint or an indication from Khrushchev that he would accept the offer this time. There's no question, presidents don't do this kind of thing. So he's actually issuing a memo saying, apparently, that we've got agreement. We don't have any documentation that says that he did agree, other than Sergei, his son, says he agreed, and then Kennedy started acting this way. Now, there's a second memo dated the same day, which the authenticity is not necessarily established, but the guys who study the MJ-12 documents, and if you're into UFOs, you know all about the MJ-12 stuff, I believe it's Dr. Wood, has found this document which says, to the CIA director, which first of all indicates that I've already talked to NASA about sharing information, and what I want you guys to do in the CIA is to tell them everything we know about UFOs so they won't get mixed up between what's a bona fide UFO and what's one of our test aircraft. So I think that Kennedy was perfectly acceptable to these people, to the secret societies that he had basically drawn a line in the sand with and said he was going to go to war with, until he actually got to the point where it looked like his dream of going to the moon with the Russians might actually become a reality. 10 days later in Dallas, he was dead. And again, there's all kinds of Masonic connections to the assassination. This is a picture that's very, it's actually a screen capture that I took from a film called the Marie Muchmore film of the assassination. And it was in a video I'd hoped to show you, but I ran out of time. And it shows President Kennedy literally at the moment he's being killed. If you look at his head, what you can see is that his hair is being brushed back. There's a spurt of red here, and it's not very red on the screen, but it's really obviously red on the computer. And clearly, to my mind, it indicates he's being shot from the front. If he had been shot from the back, like all of the medical evidence supposedly says, the back of his head would already be distorted. There would be some sort of distortion. It looks to me certainly like he's being hit from the front, not from the back. So the question was, is there any evidence that there was a conspiracy in President Kennedy's death? Because really, for our new conspiracy theory to work, there has to be at least 2 gunmen there, or there had to be some sort of connection to a conspiracy. There is a photograph called the Mary Moorman photograph, which has been studied pretty much in depth, that shows the grassy knoll. It's pretty much the only photograph that shows the grassy knoll. And some researchers back in the 1990s did some work on it. And they started looking at this area right here. And what they eventually found was a shape that looked like this. This is called Badge Man. And there's a lot of stuff on YouTube that rips it. I've been through the stuff that argues against this being a legitimate photo enhancement, and I find it really lacking. To my mind, this is legitimate photo work. And what it looks to show is a guy with his arms like this, with apparently a muzzle blast or something coming from the front, and what looks like a badge. And he's definitely got a specific, you can see his ears, his eyebrows, maybe it looks like his eyes shut, like he's aiming a rifle. And all of this is really consistent with a story told by a man named Gordon Arnold. There's a great program called The Men Who Killed Kennedy. Again, this is the video I wanted to show you. I would just say go to Badgeman on YouTube, type in Badgeman or The Men Who Killed Kennedy, and watch the Gordon Arnold sequences there. And a lot of people have tried to attack Gordon Arnold. He's since passed away. But basically his story was, I went to Dealey Plaza. I just got out of the Army, or I just got out of basic training. I was in my Army uniform. I thought there was going to be a parade. I started taking pictures. I was up on the grassy knoll. And I realized it was the president. And the next thing I know, a shot, like a rifle shot, went past my left ear really, really, really close. And I hit the deck. And a man in a policeman's uniform came around the corner, and he pointed the rifle at me, and he said, "Were you filming?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Give me your gun, give me your film." I gave him the film. I wouldn't give him my camera. And the man had no hat on, and he had dirty hands. Now, a lot of people have argued that on another occasion he said dirty fingernails as opposed to dirty hands, and that somehow that discredits his story. But if you watch the video, and I really encourage you to go watch it, to my mind, his reactions are really, really genuine when you watch the guy. In other words, I believe his story. And the thing about his story that's really important is that all this information came out, this specific story about a man in a policeman's uniform with a rifle with no hat on, came out before they ever did these Badgeman photo enhancements of the Mary Mormon photographs. There's no way Gordon Arnold could have known about the Badgeman stuff before he actually told his story. Here's an outline of what they eventually decided might be Gordon Arnold. Here's a close-up of it. Here's the Badgeman on the left. Here's what might be Gordon Arnold on the right. He looks like he's holding a camera. He's got a little pointed cap on, which is the kind of cap he was wearing. He's got a little medallion on it. In other words, it's all consistent with the story that he tells. There's another picture of another man back there. And again, you see that this is a guy that looks to be in a policeman's uniform. There's an emblem on the arm. It matches the Dallas police uniform of the day. There's a badge. There's a guy with a no hat on. Okay, just give me 1 minute. Now, the creepy thing about it is that somebody pointed out on the internet that this guy, Badgeman, has the same sort of male pattern baldness as another gentleman, this guy right here. This guy is a Dallas police officer named J.D. Tippit, okay? I'm not saying this is J.D. Tippit, and I'm certainly not implying that J.D. Tippit was part of the assassination, but it's pretty creepy to me how close they look alike. I think the eyebrows, as you can see here, look a lot alike. The pattern, the baldness pattern, the ears match. It sure looks like it might be him. And the one thing that's really important about J.D. Tippit is that that same day he was murdered by Lee Harvey Oswald. And the next day, Lee Harvey Oswald was murdered by Jack Ruby. So basically, you had motive, you had means, you had opportunity. NASA, the CIA, whoever, the simple fact that Kennedy was willing to share our most important technological secrets with the Russians would have probably been good enough reason to kill him. But if you throw in the artifacts and the fact that Kennedy was going to give this information to people outside of the secret societies, the people who felt like it was their birthright to find out what was really on the moon and what was really on Mars, then to me, I think you finally have a reason that's important enough to take a chance of killing the president. Now, I don't know that I can say that categorically. All I can say is a lot of things add up, and they look really incriminating to me. This is Congressman Albert Thomas, the guy I mentioned earlier. This is the night before the assassination. He was at a special dinner with President Kennedy in Houston. He went with Kennedy to Dallas. Here is the famous photo of LBJ taking the oath of office. There's poor Mrs. Kennedy here with the blood still on her dress from the president. And this guy right here is Congressman Albert Thomas. So he had a very, obviously, important position there, watching the whole process take place. And then what most people have never seen is the next photograph that was taken by the same photographer, which is this one. And what you see is LBJ turning to Albert Thomas out of everybody else there. His face is crinkled up in a smile, and Albert Thomas is winking at him, as if to say, and again, this is the guy who controls all the funding for NASA, as if to say to him, we got him. We got rid of our problem. And now we can go to the moon secretly. And that is the secret history of NASA as far as we're concerned. I want to leave you with one last thought, which comes from Sergei Khrushchev, which is that he said, I think if Kennedy had lived, we would be living in a completely different world. And I agree with that. Thanks.